Defined by histories of dislocation, we find ourselves in a nation seemingly not our own. The separation runs deep. Cultures, traditions, ways of being, food we eat, land it grows from, family. This estrangement was a double-edged sword, dividing people from place, sister from brother, parent from child, body from soul. And so we wander this land, looking for home. But our story begins before this great separation. We are more than land being taken, forced relocation, racialized identification. Our history stretches far beyond this past, to a time we were connected to the land, felt it beneath our feet, understood it as gift from Creator that fed us as we fed it, our flourishing tied up in each other's.
Good morning, and allow me to add my welcome to this webinar. We have so longed for this day. I have the distinct joy and privilege of introducing to you two of my favorite people. I know them both as personal friends, but also as scholars and co-conspirators. Professor Nadine Bowers du Toit is a professor of practical theology at the University of Stellenbosch. Nadine is the director of the Unit for Religion and Development Research. She's also the chair of the Practical Theology Society of South Africa. An excellent communicator with a very practical and inviting conversation style. No matter how academic the content, you always feel like you're in the conversation of a friend. This feedback session is part of a much broader research project exploring the question, does faith matter? This project is now enjoying its third feedback session, the first in 2018, the second in 2019. Today, the focus of the feedback is particularly based on the findings from Deborah's research. Now, Deborah Hancock's too is a personal friend. We both worship together at St. John's Church in Wynberg and enjoy preaching there on a regular basis. She is the wife of but one husband, Colin, and she is passionate about the local church, seeing the church live out the mission of God in the world. Deborah spent the last 20 years working in Christian NGOs and faith-based organizations, in particular ones that look at the work of development and transformation. Recently, she was appointed as the international coordinator for Micah Global, and she completed her PhD research under the supervision of Professor Nadine Bowers du Toit. It is with great joy and excitement that I introduce to you these two dynamic women, and it is with excitement that we anticipate hearing from them just how practical PhD academic research can be in service to the broader body of Christ. Thank you, ladies, for being with us. Thank you for not only sharing your findings, but for sharing your life, Both of them have served as trustees on the board of the warehouse. Nadine still continues to do that in an advisory capacity. And so we are really grateful, not only for their participation today, but for their long, continued, persistent friendship with us as an organization. Thank you.
And a huge welcome to you this morning from my home in Retreat and Deborah's in Bergfleet. You should be able to see us on the screen. I'm seeing a big picture of Caroline Powell from the warehouse, but hopefully you can see us. There we go. You can see us on the screen, and it's wonderful to have all of you with us here this morning. It's unfortunate that we can't be in the space that we wanted to be in due to COVID-19. And I know that for many of you, we would have loved to have gathered physically together, sat around tables, been able to see each other and enjoy some fellowship and some food, of course, but it's not possible this morning. But we hope that you feel really welcome. And we're so excited to have such a group of development practitioners, Christian development practitioners, ministers, and friends in general. So it's wonderful to have all of you with us this morning. So what we kind of want to do before we get started, because as you've heard, the theme of our presentation today, and hopefully also our conversation, not just presentation, is the topic of faith and development. And we want to share some of the findings of the research that we carried out in Cape Town. But the focus, as Renee said, is mainly this morning on Deborah's research. So this morning we'll have a short time now for a breakout group. And then I will share some of the basic background of the project. Afterwards, Deborah will take over and be there for most of the morning, and we'll have opportunity also, like I said, for breakout groups where we can have some conversation. So you'll be placed in a small breakout group. We're going to do that right now with no further ado. And what I'd like to ask you to do, so Matt LeBlanc, who's our tech assistant, who's been doing this for many, many years, is going to put us now into breakout groups. And we're just going to meet and greet like we would if we were in the warehouse space or we were gathered anywhere else. We're going to introduce ourselves, the organization, where we come from, and then maybe just why do you attend this webinar. Very, very quickly, we've got like 3 minutes to do so, Matt. So I'm just going to ask you now to allocate us to those groups. Thanks. I think people are still entering the space as well. Hi, everybody. If you're back, welcome back. It was quite funny. Deborah and myself landed up in a room with Tim Tucker and Colin and Caroline from the warehouse. So we just had a good personal catch up, and I hope for many of you, you could connect with familiar faces, and if not, that you could meet some new people, even in a very weird way. These are unusual times, but we really hope this morning that there will be some community created and that you'll really feel the community, even though it's in a very virtual way, and that we'll have time to interact and discuss. So I think most people are back now. So welcome back as you're coming back. If you've not used Zoom before, there's a little bubble. If you kind of move your mouse at the bottom of the screen, there's a little bubble there that allows you to chat. So yes, please go ahead and ask us questions in the chat. When I speak, Deborah will moderate for me, and when Deborah speaks, I'll moderate for her. So we'll be keeping an eye on the chat. And Colin already says, such fun to see so many friends. Hi, everyone. Okay, so you can see, please use the chat and feel free to engage that way. So first up, I will just be presenting very shortly on the background of the project. And once everyone's in, Matt will then share my screen or share the screen with everybody. And then I'll take us through some of the background to this project. So while we're waiting for that to happen, I think it's fine for me to talk about it. A few years ago, as academics are wont to do, I applied for a National Research Foundation grant. And it was really exciting to get this grant because it's one that's not given, especially to anybody in theology, But what was more exciting was to be able to study faith-based organizations, because there's been very little done on studying what faith-based organizations are doing in South Africa, how they see themselves, etc. So we focused on the Cape Metropole, and many of you, I believe, were part of the study, or some of you. And as Rene mentioned, since then, we've had some feedback sessions to share some of the data. So what I'll be doing now is just sharing some of the basic background. So for those that are not aware of what the study is, I'll frame it for you. Deborah was one of the students on the project itself, and her PhD delved much deeper into what was going on. So really excited for us to share that and to converse about that, and for us to learn whether it is a reflection or not of what you're experiencing. So thanks, Matt. You can share the the PowerPoint, and I am just looking for where I can have control of it. But that was the title of the study. Matt, I can't see any sort of way to take control of the screen. If I can just ask you,
Nadine, sorry, if I can
yes.
come in here, it's Deborah here.
Yes.
At the top, it should say view options for you. Does it say view options? And then if you drop down there, it says request remote control.
There we go. All right, got it. Thank you. We're all learning. Thanks, everybody. Yes, okay. So Neoma asked, will the different presentations be available? Yes, I think we can do that, Deborah. We'll find a way of posting that or sending it to you either via email or via Google Drive or something like that, Neoma. So thanks, everyone. I now have control. Let's see if it works. It says I can control the screen. And now I'm trying to work it, and I just can't seem to do that. There we go. Okay. Skipping now. There seems to be a time delay. So what's the background of the study? That was the official theme, was Does Faith Matter? Exploring the role of faith-based organizations as civil society actors. It was an explorative study because there haven't really been comprehensive studies done on SA. So, for example, there were studies done on HIV/AIDS and FBOs, or certain thematics and FBOs, but not generally on FBOs and not on the nature of faith within FBOs. So initially, we reported on the survey data. Today, we'll be doing survey data and Deborah's PhD. And Deborah will talk a little bit about this terminology between the Christian Development Organization that we call the CDO and the FBO. In terms of sampling, we drew from 4 databases. We used SurveyMonkey in the initial survey with 42 respondents, which sounds low, but it's actually quite high for a survey. And then we followed that up with interviews with 12 organizations. And then Deborah dug much deeper in terms of the PhD, interviewing some of you and then re-interviewing. So the initial team, or the team as it was, myself, Dr. Lisa Roux, also from the URDR, the Unit for Religion and Development Research, Dr. Barnaby Msaba, who was a postdoc, Deborah as PhD, Papile Selisi as MTH, although he's now registered as a PhD, and Neil Crump. So who are the organizations that we interviewed? What was their profile? Let's just have a look quickly. So where were they situated? Like I said, it was in the Cape Metropole. The majority were situated on the Cape Flats. Unsurprising, of course, because that's where we sadly find the highest rates of poverty. But you can see there was sort of a spread. Type of work. So looking at how the organizations registered themselves, you can see the majority registered as non-profit organizations. Some were registered as PBOs, and then there were also NPCs and voluntary organizations and trusts. What type of organization, what type of work did these organizations do? So you can see there was a wide range, and what was really interesting to us was that Christian discipleship tended to feature as highest. And what we discovered with regards to the data is that, of course, people might be doing job skills and training, but also Christian discipleship. So they marked more than one. But it was very interesting to us that this stood out. terms of the next slide, it's not moving. Matt, is there any reason why the slide's not moving currently? There we go. So other types of work: family strengthening, school strengthening, reintegration, especially ex-prisoners, drug rehab, anti-trafficking, and so forth, church mobilization, crisis pregnancy, counseling support, and also networking and capacity building. So you may see your own organization reflected in the different types of work that we've listed. Right, so of course the title of this research was Faith Matters, right? Does faith matter? And what we overwhelmingly found was faith does matter for many faith-based organizations. Now, for many of you, that sounds very obvious. You said, yeah, sure, of course. But many of the organizations that are studied in the Northern Hemisphere, or in the West, do not have such a sort of intense faith integration as what we discovered with faith-based organizations here in Cape Town. So if we look at the meaning of a Christian organization, it was really interesting. I mean, half of the organizations said that to be a Christian organization meant that the Christian faith shaped their vision, their ethos, or their values. It's actually what defines them. And many of you said this was a core motivation for the work that you do. It gave purpose to what you do. It's the core of what you do. It's the foundation of what you do. And the P with the numbers are the people that we either interviewed or the respondents in the survey. So we just coded them that way. And then in terms of Christian witness, how was that understood? It ranged to everything from just seeing the difference in the way you live, work, and operate to actually sort of propagating and demonstrating the Christian faith, being a good example, being light where there's darkness. This is some of the quotes that came through here. And what is also interesting, which wouldn't occur in the North, is that, in other words, proselytization, in other words, bringing people to Christ, was a core component of some of the work of FBOs and was, underpinned in your programs. Although many of you said, yes, we are here to witness to Christ, we don't discriminate in terms of who we serve as clients or recipients. By the way, I don't like the word clients or recipients. I think some of you may also feel the same way, but just for the purpose here, we use that word. There we go. Also very interesting, there was very little distinction between what was physical and what was spiritual and material. Many of you said development and welfare and proclamation of the gospel or evangelism were two sides of the same coin. And one noted that faith forms the foundation of what we do. It is integral to our approach, our material, and our outcome. So there were various ways in which faith-based organizations talked about faith integration or reported on faith integration. Some talked about teaching Christian values and ethos. Others talked about creating a space for faith being integrated in the day-to-day practices and in their long-term strategy. Others talked about spiritual practices like prayer and scripture reading. Others talked about the ways it was integrated into program materials. And still others talked about the actual witness in communities in which they served. So what were the scriptural foundations? This was really interesting to me as a theologian. So we asked faith-based organization leaders, is there a Bible verse or a Bible story that motivates you in your work? And so many of them just listed it. And so I had to go and actually look these up and then analyze what were some of the themes that came through. Well, in no particular order, compassionate action was one, talking about love thy neighbor, Christ's love compels us, Jesus' example in the gospel text. So there were many texts about compassionate action. There were other FBOs who referred to justice texts, the prophets, for especially Isaiah, Micah. There were still others who referred to text around holistic witness, like the scripture in James, true and pure religion in God's eyes is one that looks after widows and orphans in distress. And then what was really interesting to me was there were quite a number of FBOs that used the theme of restoration emerged through the scriptures that they cited. And so there you can see particularly Isaiah, a number of FBOs referred to Isaiah and about rebuilding and restoration and reconstruction, if you will. Jeremiah 29, of course, we all know that one. I know the plans I have for you, was mentioned by 3 of the respondents. And if you consider that there were 42 respondents and 3 of them mentioned, well, perhaps it's not that statistically relevant, but it's very interesting to me that this was a text. And I thought the most obvious interpretation was obviously the encouragement of this text to the organization itself, but then even maybe that the vulnerable and the marginalized that some of the FBOs are working with often view themselves as unloved and as if they have no purpose, although we know that they are created in the image of God. And so perhaps this text refers to the kind of hope, meaning, and purpose that organizations want to, sort of activate in those they work. So money matters, always an interesting one for FBOs, having served on many boards, having been employed in an FBO myself. We know that this is a really, really important aspect of our work. And so we're going to look at where does funding come from, how does it possibly influence the work that is done, what is the relationship with donors that FBOs reported on. So in terms of annual expenditure, so this survey was taken in around 2017, so the data's not too old. It obviously would have shifted a little bit, but you can see the majority of budgets were between $1 million and $3 million there, followed by 4 to 7 million closely, and then I think 100,000 to 300,000. So you can see the vast majority of FBOs that we at least interviewed were in the 1 million to 3 million. So what sources of funding did FBOs report that they had? And this was a particularly interesting thing to look at. You can see the South African government is one of the biggest funders of faith-based organizations, with those public-private partnerships that many FBOs have, followed by individual Christians in South Africa. Interesting to see churches in South Africa, less income generating activities is another one. And I think that's an interesting feature of FBO work in the past couple of years, as we've seen many of our organizations begin to move to try and be more self-sustaining and doing their own income generating activities. So what are the sort of the 3 main challenges your organization faced with regards to donors? This is the question that we asked. Some of the things here, which I'm sure you're going to see are quite obvious, or things that you could identify with. Having to fit in with donor requirements and their way of doing things. Lack of fundraising capacity was high on the list, in terms of skills, in terms of time, I think even in terms of people. Also, some mentioned some causes were a hard area to sell to donors. And then the whole thing of securing long-term sort of relational funding as opposed to short-term project-based funding. Faith identity and values reduces the donor pool, although you'll see that this wasn't so big in South African FBOs. Very interesting. Donors who do not want to fund salaries and other indirect costs, what many of us call the big black hole. So donors want to fund projects, they don't want to fund the big black hole. General decrease in donor and donor giving were some of the challenges. So what were the most sustainable funding sources? Well, when we interviewed and so forth, most funding is relationally based. And I think in the interview analysis that we discovered that one of the most sustainable sources of donor income for FBOs or CDOs, Christian development organizations, was individual Christians or families that had been long-term donors. And it was important to note that organizations that mentioned the sustainability of this kind of income were usually founded from a group of churches or a congregation. And so they were building on relational capital. And then another sustainable funding source, of course, like I mentioned, was this whole thing of private public partnerships, doing work for government, etc. But of course, this couldn't completely ensure sustainability. So we still needed to apply for donor funding outside of it. So it looked like for many of the organizations, at least at that time that we interviewed, the relationship between the organization and their donors was fairly strong. Of course, some were fragile, but the vast majority said that their donor relationships were strong or very strong. And of course, COVID, we don't know what COVID will do to these kinds of aspects. So going into faith and donor funding, I was super fascinated as an academic anyway, that the majority of organizations said, listen, it doesn't matter how difficult it is, our relationships with donors is determined by our own mission and our strategy and not by their funding. And I think that it's also interesting to note the majority of FBOs, at least in Cape Town that we interviewed, we asked, had staff and volunteers who self-identified as Christians. Again, this is not the case, for example, in the Global North or the West. And many of the FBOs were clear, like, we are not going to accept donor funding if it steers us away from our strategy, which is, of course, quite brave. It was also interesting to note that the organizations that were sort of heavily funded by government departments were actually said, well, we're quite explicit with them about our faith, and this hasn't affected our relationships or the donor funding. I remember interviewing one individual and her actually saying, well, you know, basically one of the government departments that she worked with said to me, you have the best success rate, so carry on as you are. And there was one quote that stayed with me. You'll see at the bottom, one organization noted that discarding the historical Christian identity of its organization to please a funder, in this case, they were asked to remove their logo, which clearly displayed their Christian identity. And I remember she said, it was like saying, this is not my father, this is not my mother, so we can't do it for anyone else. In other words, we cannot disown a parent. God is our parent. I love that. So relationship with local congregations, this very brief, you can read, we will be posting in the chat some of the links. Somebody asked, I think Neoma Finta asked about, will they receive some of the stuff, but we will post in the links some of the articles that have been published. This one is published by Papile Kairisi, and he looked at the relationship with local congregations. I'm just going to very briefly look here at what's happening. There we go. So I hope you can see it. It's a little bit blurry. There we go. It's coming into focus. So the majority of Christian development organizations or FBOs had a relationship with the local congregation. And interesting, most of their relationships with local congregations had to do with either people from a local congregation, either volunteering or working at that particular organization. Interesting, it was not necessarily congregations in the area, which I think highlights maybe an issue that were collaborating with the FBOs. Let me just go back there. So some of the collaboration efforts that we see there. So again, you can see volunteers and funding, and then also spiritual support was very important. 94% said they had a relationship with the local congregation, and the power of volunteerism is very, very evident in these particular findings. They also received financial support from local congregations. So, colleagues, we have now, if I look at the time, it is exactly right on time for where we could have a little bit of discussion in the chat if you want to. If we see questions coming up there, could you identify with some of the survey results? Do you have any questions or comments on the research? I know I went through it really quickly and I talk very fast sometimes, so I'll totally understand if you're still sort of absorbing it. But yes, is there anything you can identify with or that you'd like to comment on? Matt, you can shut down the PowerPoint discussion, thanks. And we'll go back to main screen. Right, there we are. So Deborah, if you look in the chat, everybody, Deborah's actually posted those 3 links over there. The one has to do with the faith-based nature of organizations. There's one on donor engagement. Then there's the one by Papile, the centrality of partnership. And so they're free to download off the website. Okay, so we'll open for questions. Are there any questions on the chat? Please post them in the chat. I think everybody has been muted. So, right. Okay, Skip, hi Skip, welcome. Show again where funding comes from. Where Skip, let's just see here. Can you share that slide, please, Matt? Otherwise, I will. Right, so let's go. Skip, let me just have a look where. Okay, so one back. There we go. So that's it. So there we go, Skip. So South African government highest, followed by individual Christians, and then it kind of looks like South African donor organizations, trusts, lotto, and own income generation activities are on par. SA Business also features. And then it says other individuals in South Africa. I'm not sure how we define that. I think there was an option there. Tim, you're saying, were we able to draw any conclusions on the organizational? Matt, you can stop screen sharing there. Thanks. Were we able to draw any conclusions on the organizational sustainability of the FBOs surveyed? Well, at that particular time, the ones that we surveyed seemed to be fairly stable. And part of the reason for this, I think, is my suspicion, is that because it was funded by largely funded by South African individuals at that time and not international donors, people were not as affected, or organizations were not as affected by what was happening. So at that time, they said stable to fairly stable was some of the stats that we released. So we can actually give you a more in-depth breakdown, when we send it to you. And then, okay, so then Nkosinati asked, can it be sent by email? Yes, we can. We will definitely make a plan either to send a link to a Google Drive or to attach it for you. Caroline Powell is asking, she says, I'm interested in the relationship between the organizations and churches. Yes, and to hear more on the reflections from the organizations on the relationships with congregations. Do they feel connected, supported? Do they feel they're able to shape the theology, attitudes, and actions of congregations? That is the central question for Deborah and myself, Caroline. So that was only, the partnership stuff was only asked in the survey, but Deborah goes a little bit into this. So Deborah, I think you've got some leeway here to speak into this, and I think Deborah will be speaking into this with the findings from her PhD research. Okay, yes, Deborah says we'll email out the links. And then Merle asks, could we receive the above links in an email? Yes, I think we can ensure that, and we'll ask Lynette from the warehouse. Deborah and I will make sure of that. Thanks, colleagues. I think if anybody has another question, maybe just, oh, here's another one that I missed. Sorry, here to Claudie, very interesting observations. I identify with most as I worked for a national FBO some years ago. Thank you so much. Yes, that's very interesting. I think when we've presented some of these results over the past 2 years, we have seen generally that FBOs say, yeah, actually that reflects it. Okay, I see myself, or I see my organization, which is of course exciting for us because as researchers, we would like our data to represent what's really out there. So thanks. Okay, thanks everybody. I have a terrible habit of calling people colleagues. I'm sorry, that's a silly academic thing. My husband thinks it's very funny. With no further ado, I hand over to Deborah.
Thanks, Nadine. Hi, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I can't say it's great to be with you because I do miss being in a workshop space together. I think so many of us in the non-profit sector, that's the way we function, by meeting up in rooms, giving each other hugs, being able to catch up. But yeah, I'm grateful for this space, and I do feel today like I'm amongst friends. There are even those of you with us today who were my research participants, so you might even hear some of your wonderful words being played back to you. Okay, so a little bit of a delay. Yeah, as I was saying, it's a slightly daunting task to take what was the work of 4 years and 300 pages and put it into 1 hour in a way which I'm really hoping will have value for all of you. And, you know, I spent a large amount of time, as Nadine will know, getting used to theology speak and academic language. And now I'm trying to unlearn that. So your patience would be appreciated. Right, before I start, I just want to pick up on what Nadine said, a word about terminology. I use this term Christian Development Organization, and I used it because I needed to identify my unit of research. Quite specifically, we use a lot of terms fairly loosely, and we generally know what we mean. Particularly the term FBO gets used quite a lot. We use other terms like NPO, Christian NGO, social ministry, and so forth. I needed to be a little bit more precise, and FBO is a term that needed to be broken down a little bit more. It's not necessarily a term that I'm hugely attached to. I think it's a useful term, and if it's useful for you, you can use it. I wrote an article about it, one of my chapters, and that link will also be placed with the other links. The definition that I'm working with, just to give you that, is to say that a Christian development organization I define as a civil society organization that exists to promote human well-being through development activities, guided by its understanding and application of the Christian faith. And quite obviously, we get all shapes and sizes of CDOs. We get big international ones like World Vision and Tearfund, and we also get many, many, many small grassroots organizations which might only be working in one little community. They all fall within this definition of Christian development organization. Just to say, my journey with CDOs began about 20 years ago when I felt God calling me to walk a road with people. Oh, I get emotional when I think about it. Sorry, not very academic, right? To walk a road with people involved in social ministries and to help where I could, providing facilitation and organizational development services. And I know I've worked with many of you who are on this call today, so it's great that you're here. This picture I'm showing you is of a group of such organizations called Salt Alliance. They aren't Cape Town based, but they operate across the country, and they are typical of the people that I had so much joy in working with. The question that I was asked on several occasions over the years is, why do these Christian organizations, these so-called parachurch organizations, exist, as well as congregations? And where do these parachurch so-called organizations fit within the bigger picture of the church? This question became more pressing for me as I observed the rise of the missional church conversation. You know, that the conversation that says, how do we restructure and reform the church as a participant in God's mission? And seeing that generally my observation was that this was a very congregational conversation, and it failed to represent the fullness of God's mission as holistic, liberating, integral, and one that includes both material and spiritual dimensions of life. This I saw as a problem because, this was a problem I saw because there was no rich understanding of the CDO. You couldn't go to a book and find out, why do CDOs exist? And if you scratch the surface, what do you find theologically, biblically, missiologically, They were sort of treated as those organizations out there who were doing good works, and that was great. And if we needed to show the world what the church was doing, we could point to them, but very little more. So I really did feel an invitation from the Lord to place organizations, CDOs, under a microscope and look at them at the level of the cell. What's going on at a cellular level in these organizations? So that was really the research that I undertook. And very briefly, whoopsie daisy, research methodology. I interviewed 18 CDOs, all falling within the Cape Town Metropole. The Cape Town Metropole was the delimitation of the research project that Nadine was running. And my methodology was something called classic grounded theory, which we don't need to really go into, but just to understand that with classic grounded theory, you don't start with any theory. You merely, you go open, as they say, and you just look for what you find. Yeah. I'm just going to, right. I think someone's got their speaker on. I think Carla, you've got your speaker on. I'm just going to mute you if I may. Thank you. Right. So in terms of these interviews with 18 CDOs, and in terms of classic grounded theory, what it resulted in was a theory which I called a theory of waymaking. And that's what I'm going to describe to you in this first session. If you like, the first session is the what. What did I discover? And the second session will be the so what. What is the relevance of that? With grounded theory, the approach says that the first thing you have to do is identify the main concern of the group that you are researching. And in all of this data, I had loads and loads of data. I ended up with, let me just see the number of the codes I had, something like about 250 open codes I ended up with. There were many concerns that the CDOs I was interviewing held. For example, there was a concern for people living in very difficult socioeconomic situations. There was a concern about the inability of the church, the local congregation, to respond to the group they were helping. There was a concern of, well, how do we do this? But when I dug deeper and really spent time thinking and merging data, what emerged for me was a sense of a main concern, was a concern to be true to their calling. And here's a quote from one of the interview participants who said, success is to be faithful to our calling, that sense of calling that God has placed on our hearts. Once you've identified the main concern with your participants, and just to say a little step back into methodology, although this data is what it is, the rendition or the depiction of the data is certainly my interpretation of it. So there's this element of, critical realism where we say this data is given to us, but it's also interpreted. So someone else who used the same data might have come up with a different theory, might well have. So this is my representation of the data which was entrusted to me. So the main concern of the Christian Development Organization, to be true to their calling, gets resolved constantly through what is called a core category. So that's the dynamic in a grounded theory. What is the main concern and how does it get resolved? And the resolution is seen in a spiritual dynamic, which I named this thing called following to make a way, and illustrated by this one research participant who said, we help others by showing them the way. So there's this wonderful thing going on whereby the CDOs have a calling, and in order to be true to that calling, they are needing to follow God step by step, every step of the way. And in their following, they are also then creating a way for other people, their so-called beneficiaries, not the best term, but the people they're working with, to find a way to a fuller life, to greater flourishing, and also into relationship with God. I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes looking at this. I'm just checking my time here. 10:53. Right. A couple of minutes looking into this concept of following to make a way, which is a spirituality. I'll just read you a little bit out of what I wrote about it. It says, in following to make a way, the CDO seeks to show their beneficiary a way to a better life. But as they do so, they are also constantly finding the way for themselves as an organization. These are contingent actions. The CDO must do their own following in order to help facilitate the beneficiary's following. God is experienced as leading the CDO at the same time as he is seen to be leading the beneficiary. As one leader said, it's not about how much we do, but about working with God's plan inspired by Holy Spirit, guiding us in what we need to do so that God can do in the beneficiary's life what we cannot do with our hands or influence with our words, but somehow mysteriously we are a part of it. So in this following to make a way, there are three different properties that emerged that work together. The first is a sense that the CDO is constantly aligning themselves. They're aligning themselves with God. They're aligning themselves with their context and with their beneficiary. And that is really almost a vertical, a plumb line part of the spirituality. It holds quite tightly to the second part, which is a pursuing, which is an active forward movingness, which is necessary. You know, the way I described it here was that pursuing is not a leisurely affair. It involves actively, intently, and purposefully following. There is a sense of movement and speed, going from one place to the next, trying to catch up to where they think they should be, and quite often this involves confusion and retreat, rerouting and advance. And pursuing is pursuing Jesus. As one participant said, the only way is to see how Jesus did it. It's like building an engine, but you have no experience and no manual. It's trial and error until it works. Then, you know, in pursuing, you need to maintain a state of being and a sense of living from the core. That state of being, of joy and peace, which is sometimes in contradiction to the circumstances in which you find yourself, but always rooting yourself back in your core. And between the aligning and the pursuing, they both necessitate acting. So one participant said, Jesus saw the crowds. He just got out of the boat and he saw a crowd of people and he had compassion on them. And above all that, it is written in there, he did something for them. He healed the sick and whatnot. So this sort of activist spirituality, that comes through in this following to make a way. And this is at the heart of the CDO's spirituality, as I found amongst these 18 participants. Just to say also that grounded theory doesn't seek to generalize. So what I'm saying it about my research participants. I'm not claiming it as being a universal truth for all CDOs. I think in different contexts, you would find very different main concerns and core categories. Right, so then stepping out into the bigger theory, the full theory of waymaking as it came from the data, before any literary engagement or anything like that, we have being faithful to their calling is constantly resolved through following to make a way. That's the dynamic. Following to make a way leads to two different strategies. The one I called helping holistically. That's the primary strategy of what it is you do programmatically as CDOs. But it also leads to this interesting one, and this touches on your question, Caroline, and a particular area of interest for Nadine and myself. It's the sense of extending the congregation. They're also involved in that. Both of these strategies of helping holistically and extending the congregation require that there is a strong sustaining organization, the CDO organizational engine itself. Otherwise, it doesn't continue to function. So what I'm going to do is just, and I hope I don't overwhelm you with words. I can hear Nadine holding her breath at this point. I've got, let me see, session 1 goes up until 10:20. Right, So if we double click on that primary strategy of helping holistically, what I found was that there were 3 elements to it. The primary one is a process that has a beginning and an end. And this process can be seen in various forms across all 18 of the CDOs that I interviewed. For some of the CDOs, their process, beginning to end, might take 3 weeks. For others, it might take 5 years. It depends on the nature of the program and whether you're working, for example, in a job readiness program versus working with women who are working in prostitution, or if you're working with people coming out of prison. The nature of the type of program dictates the duration of this process. But in all of them, there were these steps that you would see. The first was a step of seeking and inviting. How do you make contact? Do you go and meet them on the streets in an outreach? Do you advertise at a taxi rank? Do you get it out through word of mouth? But then there's always you go and you seek and you invite. The second step in the process is a process of raising awareness or facilitating awareness. This stage includes quite often a strong element of helping people to find identity, to tell stories, to reflect, to just stop some of the craziness that they might be living in and come into a place of raised awareness. This stage may include, but does not always include, Christian practices such as prayer and learning about God and their identity in Him. So, some do, some don't. Quite often, most of them do. So it's a phase of finding identity and replacing a false identity that has been placed on them in many cases. As one program manager describes about the group that he works with, youth are fed lies about self-esteem, identity, potential. Replacing that with God's truth, that is the key part of the journey. Saying at root level, this is who you are. You might be a murderer, but at the core, you are made in God's image with gifts. So replacing stigma and lies with God's truth about who they are. That's this first step of raising awareness. Moving on from this phase of raising awareness, there's another phase of imparting. One might have called this training or equipping, but it's a richer thing than just training. So imparting has an initial phase of laying foundations and is followed in some cases, and if the beneficiary wants to, by a phase of building on the foundations through this. And it's a foundation of learning various forms of hard and soft skills, developing knowledge, and so forth, that will equip them and move them on a journey towards greater flourishing in life. This is often the sort of programmatic delivery part of the CDO. Following this, there's a phase of connecting. So connecting is about connecting the beneficiaries to wider support systems and opportunities, such as congregations, places of work, education and training, accommodation, health services, government support, and so forth. That's that connecting element. And then there's always a celebration moment, whether it's a graduation or a sending out or something happens whereby the CDO loves to mark this event that says, this journey, this process up to so far, we now celebrated and we send you out. But then they always like to stay open, and follow-up care is not always that easy on the resources that CDOs have. But in a way, the CDOs are your real softies. You will always really be open to someone coming back if they're struggling or they haven't been able to progress as they wanted. This process, beginning to end, has an enabling environment, which I call enabling help. And if you like, it's like the milieu or the context that has to exist for helping to take place. And this has a number of phases that I'm just going to, not phases, it has a number of properties that I'm just going to touch on very briefly. If you want more detail, you can read about it in December. The PhD will be available. What CDOs do is they create transitioning spaces where people can come as they are and engage with different people, different services, different interactions, and move from being one thing to being another. The enabling environment is about love. So love entails, as I saw in the data, a deep commitment to a person or a community. The communities can also be beneficiaries. A commitment to journey with them, to see wholeness, healing from traumas, from terrible life circumstances, and to see them empowered to live a better life. As one participant said, it's a gritty, long-term, messy road, walking that with people in ups and downs, a roller coaster, but you don't give up on them. We show that love consistently, they are not dropped. This is not a program. So there's this, another person said, working at a community context, said, we want to show this community what the love of Christ looks like. And that leads on to the next aspect of representing. They want you to represent the love of Christ. This next property of Adventing is a personal favorite of mine, showing some of my Anglican roots. You know, the season of Advent, when we celebrate the coming of Jesus. And it's a condition I see, or a circumstance I see in the CDOs, where they hold hope on behalf of their beneficiaries based on what they know Jesus has done, is doing, and will yet do. So it's like a holding of hope that creates an enabling environment. They also, the CDOs also narrate, they tell stories of what they see, and this is a form of advocacy also, and a call to action. We know it helps with fundraising as well, but it is really about getting stories out. And increasingly, of course, I see that the CDOs are creating platforms for beneficiaries to tell their own stories through videos, through recording their stories. And then finally, there's a sense of co-laboring, that they are co-laboring with God in this work that they're doing. So that is enabling help. The final bit of helping holistically is this thing called extending help, which falls outside the scope of what the CDOs do. It's pointing to the expected outcome. And I think now of my friend Susan Farrell, who I think is on this call, it's kind of what they are looking to see happening and what they do see happening. And that is that they see their beneficiaries growing and flourishing in life to various degrees. Obviously, there are times when it's not successful, but the intent and the reality is that people do begin to grow and flourish. For some of the CDOs, there's also an explicit intent that the people that they work with will themselves become waymakers. So, you know, I'm saying that CDOs are waymakers. They're preparing the way of the Lord. They're making open the way for the Lord to come in. A lot of the way, quite often the CDOs work in a way where they are wanting those people that they're working with to themselves go back into their communities and become waymakers. And it harks back to, you know, that scripture in Isaiah that was very popular in the early 2000s when many of us were starting CDOs, which is to say, they shall be oaks of righteousness. And it speaks to that element. Yeah. So that's helping holistically at high speed. I hope you're still with me. Back to our picture of the theory. The second strategy, which is more of a slightly hidden one, with some of the CDOs, it is central and intentional, but for most, it's kind of a secondary strategy, this thing called extending the congregation. And I've purposely not called it extending the church, because I think that we are still figuring out what church is at this stage. So I like to talk about congregation. So where are we time-wise? Okay, we're doing okay. Extending the congregation. I entered this research, as my research proposal will show, that thinking that there wasn't much of a relationship really between a lot of CDOs and congregations, but I was proven wrong. both in the survey data, which Nadine and Papile have written about, but also in terms of my own research. I see that the CDOs carry a great, what can I say, love, is that the right word? Carry a great consciousness of the congregation and the relationship to it. So what you see happening are these 5 different dimensions, which I'll just briefly touch on. The first dimension is a bridging dimension. So how does the CDO extend the congregation? What you find is that people who start CDOs tend to hear about what it is that they want to be doing very often while they're in the church. The sermons, the worship, the fellowship, the reading of scripture. A lot of the CDOs are birthed in a congregational context. And that's just something to be aware of. So there's 3 ways in which the CDO extends the congregation through a bridging function. The first one of outbridging is an activity that enables what is inside the congregation, people, resources, values, priorities, the gospel, and so forth, to get out and become known and useful in the world beyond the congregation. One of the participants talks about beyond the walls of the church. There's a sense that there's this place beyond the walls of the church. So CDOs, they start by outbridging themselves, by hearing this call. It's interesting, they don't feel, there was no one really said no, that we were sent. They talk about being called, not sent. It's an interesting concept that. So they outbridge themselves. They provide a bridge for church laity, particularly in the form of volunteers, to also come and connect. One participant said they like to offer opportunities for people in congregations to exercise their spiritual muscles, what they have learned in church, that they can go and apply that on the streets. Outbridging also happens through training and other support that helps clergy to themselves lead initiatives within their communities. So there's also a training of clergy function. The second form of bridging is in-bridging into the congregation, which is the means through which people, skills, resources, experience, and knowledge enter into the congregation. And there's a whole host of types of resources that you see coming into the church, into the congregation, because of this in-bridging function. One of the important aspects of in-bridging is that of in-bridging people, and most notably their beneficiaries. It's a key area that requires us to put our heads together as congregations and CDOs, because people who are being reached by CDOs and are very often coming to know the Lord as personal Savior through the work of the CDO are struggling to find homes in congregations. So that's the in-bridging function. A third type of bridging is what I call cross-bridging. Cross-bridging occurs between congregations and therefore between denominations, when the CDO connects different congregations and congregants who otherwise would not easily connect. As elaborated, I don't think I'll read that, it's a bit of a long, no, I'll read it. As elaborated by this leader when he says, there is lots of work to be done in bridging across segregation, race, poverty. Through our network, we are bringing churches together, all different denominations, united in mission. They are able to come together around a common heart and shared issues. We try and facilitate and mobilize and unite the church on mission. So that's this cross-bridging, this ecumenical function that's happening. The second way in which the CDO is extending the congregation is through equipping the congregation, whereby congregations are helped in their response to the socio-economic needs in their own or in other communities. As one CDO leader explains, we sense that a lot of churches we work with are in either survival or retreat mode and are overwhelmed by the challenges of poverty and gang activity in their neighborhoods. We want to equip the church to be able to address that. So various forms of equipping of the congregation that gets done. So part of equipping is also helping people to understand that they also need to seek to change root causes. This is a whole nother conversation for a whole nother time. You know, the sense that we do need to respond as Christians to immediate needs, to the hungry child, but we also need to look at the greater systemic issues that allow a child to be hungry in the first place. So there's that sort of thing. So one organization said, they want to convince churches not to start a soup kitchen to help the poor. This is advocacy that works to equip the congregation to understand more richly issues of social justice and so forth in the equipping. The other property that you see in terms of extending the church is that of representing. So the congregation is often, the CDO is often the entity that is out there by people who aren't really church people, seen as representing the church. One participant said, in this community, we do not claim to be connected to such and such a church, congregation. I won't name them, obviously. We've never said it to anybody, and yet they know it. There's a mystery in that. We even had the Minister of Social Development when he officially opened our new venue in the community, and he said, we never even said this to him or asked him to say it, but these were his words. He said, the success of this organization is because this is the church in action. The fourth way in which the CDO extends the congregation is this thing called substituting, which you see at play. Now, substituting occurs intentionally and unintentionally when the CDO becomes the spiritual home of staff, volunteers, or beneficiaries because they are not able to find and attend a suitable congregation. Do I hear bells ringing? Do I hear people say, gosh, yeah, I see that. So one participant said, people in this community have a lot of fear related to the church. Churches that are legalistic, controlling, more like sects. They end up not going to church. People can be very religious, but they don't know the love and grace of God. They feel unworthy. That is why our Wednesday morning prayer and word time is so necessary. So there's this substituting function. The CDO is substituting for the congregation at times. And then finally, I didn't see this a lot because as I mentioned, the CDO helping holistically, it's a process beginning to end. CDOs don't, as I see it, normally intend to become congregations, but a few of the participants that I was working with, that I interviewed, not too many, were now becoming. So none of the CDOs interviewed were formed with the intention of becoming a church. However, when in-bridging of their beneficiaries has failed after many attempts, they consciously decided to become a Christian fellowship and add sacramental church activities, communion, baptism, and so forth, to what they do and to become a community. One program manager said, and this is someone who has many, many years in the field, really from the last century, this person said, the people we work with can't just be drawn into a local church. People are clumsy. I have settled with the understanding that what is established cannot accommodate us. So we are planting a new church. And who knows, maybe this is God's way of planting new churches. Further research required. Right, in the 5 minutes I've got left before the break, I'm just going to touch on the last of the key elements of this theory of waymaking, namely that of sustaining organization. So this helping holistically, this extending the church would not happen were there not an organization that existed to help it happen. And it's just a fairly simple model that emerged. There's the inception point, where I said, people become aware of a cause or an issue. They have a strong sense of calling that is quite specific to work with people or a community. As one participant said, our CDO exists because God gave us a heart for this community. It was birthed out of God's vision and he gave it to us. There's strong conviction there. But the two key elements of this sustaining organization, it's something around forming and something around habitualizing. So CDOs are constantly forming themselves. That's why I could keep myself in business for many years doing strategic planning, because organizations are always forming, moving forward in this organizational forming that they do. And this organizational forming focuses around activities such as defining purpose, cultivating approaches, and seeing how they can extend themselves, not necessarily to grow big, but to let others use from their learning and programs. So there's this ongoing organizational forming. You are never formed. At the same time, there's also a strong element of individual and team forming, which, yeah, so it's a sense that the people in the organization are also needing to be formed as much as the organization is needing to be formed. And there's an ongoing forming of people as well. So team members feel stretched and grow in their Christian faith through working or volunteering in the CDO. One leader reflects on this as follows. We go on a journey, each one of us, of transformation. I'm not the same person I used to be 7 years ago. This ministry, this organization, these people, this community has transformed me. And I'll just close with, no, I think I must move on. I won't say that. The other aspect of forming is habitualizing. So to balance out this very dynamic forming that is happening, there's this rooting into a very strong set of habits. You know, I sort of almost had a picture of like a monastery. There's this habitualizing that goes on, which keeps you rooted while you've got this dynamic forming. So it's around maintaining your identity, strong identity that you have as an organization. You see that in logos, in names, and so forth. There's a sense of being a community. Quite often people talk about themselves as being a family, a community, a tribe, this CDO. Prayer is a pervasive and essential part of every CDO. It was interesting that I didn't see the study of scripture as central. It was more like scripture gives certain principles, and maybe I just didn't research enough, or I didn't research this particular point, but the habit of praying is very important and pervasive. Obviously the Bible is important, but I don't know to what extent it's being poured over as perhaps it could be. And then the final thing, and I'm going to end with this before we have the break, is this element of persevering. Finally, habitualizing has the property of persevering. This is the potential, there is potential for the work of the CDO to become overwhelming. The needs are so great. We want to do this all for Jesus, and it can be overwhelming. What do we do? So there's a need to develop a habit of persevering in the face of struggles that the CDO encounters in their work. Persevering is necessary because, quote, when you are doing frontline gospel work like that, there is attack, there's spiritual warfare. And this question of being able to persevere, to pace yourself, to keep going, even against the odds, it's learnt over time. It's a learnt habit. Persevering. It's obviously a grace and a gift, but it's learned. One leader says she is seasoned in the work she is doing and does not get discouraged. She does not focus on what is not going well, but, quote, celebrates the small things and focuses on all the times when God has showed up in unexpected ways and confirmed that what they are doing is right. So CDOs are able to persevere as they have faith that God is still going to do great things in and through the organization. And on that note, it's time for our break. So we're going to break for 10 minutes, and afterwards we'll come back and I will look at kind of the so what of this theory of waymaking, this, you know, the CDO. Where does this fit within an understanding of mission and within an understanding of church and church as participant in mission?
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. And we are going to hand over, oh, something dropped there, Deborah. We're going to hand back over to Deborah soon. What I just want to do, while some of you are maybe still coming back from your comfort breaks and your tea breaks, is to just let Deborah respond to some of the questions that were asked. So, Deborah, the one question that was asked was, if you define your definition of development activities includes relief and relief and betterment activities. That's a question from Malaysia.
Yeah, thanks, Nadine, for that question. And I'm just seeing here, yeah, from Sue Chu Lee in Malaysia. Lovely to have someone from Malaysia with us today. Development is obviously a very broad term. It's also a contentious term. It's an area which, as Christians, we've sometimes just tumbled into because it's helped to meet our needs. And in and of itself, it's a whole topic for another conversation. It needs to be deconstructed. It needs to be critiqued. It can be often a form of neocolonialism, but it can also be something positive, like we have transformational development. So just to sort of as an aside to say there's a whole thing going on there. But the way that I think of development activities, I talk about them as relief, development, care, and advocacy. So all of those 4 areas would fall into the work of development. And some people might focus more on elements of care or relief. Other people might focus more on areas of advocacy and addressing systemic issues. We need to be thinking of the full socio-ecological, spread from the individual to the systemic when we're thinking about development. Nadine, I'm sure you could add something to that as well.
No, I think that's 100%, Deborah.
Yeah,
but I mean,
answer.
Yeah. But I think this is something, we could always have another conversation around if people are interested. Then Lynette asked, what do you consider elements of a strong, sustainable organization?
Look, I think it is that element of knowing why they exist, of having that clear sense of calling and purpose. If you take away the calling and the purpose of these organizations to bring about a particular change, they will cease to exist. They can't just carry on going through the motions. The other element of a strong, sustainable organization is the leadership and, leading by example, and the sense of community that gets created. That's also very critical, as well as I've mentioned, the elements of prayer and spiritual habits. Other things are necessary, obviously, like funding, but at a core, it's the purpose and the people, if I could just put it in 2 Ps like that.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I think there were some other questions about how we would distribute, we would disseminate some of the stuff. So we'll pick that up with you. Don't worry, Deborah's PhD is being finalized now for submission. She is now Dr. Hancock's, as far as I'm concerned. She will graduate in December, but her PhD will probably only officially be loaded later. But I'm sure that we can make it available in some form to you if you're interested. Just to note, we've done several rounds of feedback. This is Deborah's first official feedback on her PhD. And Deborah's indicated in the chat that she's very open to further engagement. I think also with Skip people like Mergon, if you want to set that up, yes, of course we have to liaise with Deborah. Thanks everyone. I'm going to hand back over to Deborah now in terms of her second part of the presentation.
Thank you, Nadine. Okay, so in the first session, I presented the theory purely from data, which is what you do with grounded theory in the beginning. But grounded theory also requires following this very sort of bottom up or inductive move, that you also engage literature and that you need to locate your theory within the existing literature. It can't just be floating off into space. But we don't engage literature in order to validate the theory. We say that the theory is validated more by its grab and its relevance for the people about whom it is. It's not validated by existing theories which might not validate it. So the second part of what I want to touch on just briefly, and I'm just looking at my time here, I want to go on until I think till about 10 past, I think, and share with you want to share with you something of how we take this work of what is happening in the CDO and how do we locate it within conversations that are going on about mission and about church, and bringing those two together, conversations about this thing that is called missional church, which is how the church becomes a participant in God's mission of holistic redemption. So going on from this point here at the slides, just go to the next one. Request remote control, request. We're also learning Zoom. Right, let's see if we've got the control now. Page down. A little bit of a delay. Okay. So we're back. So there was the theory. To cut a very long story short, when I took this theory and I was allowed to now start reading the literature to see where might it locate itself, and particularly because my research question was around this missional church conversation, I looked particularly at the missiological literature and the missional literature, but not only that. What emerged was that there were 4 areas which one could call missional. And missional is not a fancy word, it's just something, it's an adjective that describes being about God's mission. So the sense of the main concern of being true to their calling, we could term that as a missional calling because of the nature of the work that the CDOs are doing. The second element of the core category of following to make a way is very definitely a missional spirituality. And I can't go into it now, but it's really fascinating that it is a type of spirituality that is very different to what is often considered a religious spirituality, even a Christian spirituality, which is about almost being withdrawn and reflective, which is good, but you know, this is more driven from an activist point of view. The mission, the strategy of helping holistically, of working with your beneficiaries, is very much a missional encounter. And there's a lot that's written about, particularly by people like Clippy Critzinger and others, talking about encounters. We seek to have these transformative encounters. And then I was left with these 2 elements of the congregation and the CDO itself, the sustaining organization. And putting these 2 together, you could see that they formed a cluster of missional communities. So just very briefly, and I don't want to try and fit more in than I can in the time available, but once again, using literature, but also sticking very closely to the data, I looked at the data again to say, what are the characteristics of a missional calling that we see emerging within the work and the practice and the praxis of the CDO? And 3 characteristics emerged around the calling. The first is that it's a calling that is received from God. That is held very strongly by the CDOs, that God has called them to this. The other is a serving, a sense of service and serving, but it's the sense that they're serving God by serving others. And that's a wonderful loving God and loving your neighbor, and not being able to detach serving God and serving others. The 2 hold together. And then the third element of the calling is this calling to compassionate action that the CDOs carry. And compassion, of course, you know, it's a much deeper word than sympathy or even empathy. It's God is a God of compassion. You know, there's so many beautiful verses in the Bible that talk about God as a God of compassion, and his whole mission is rooted in his compassion. Moving on to look at the spirituality of the CDO, that core category of following to make a way, the characteristics that emerge through literature and data point to the CDO spirituality as being purposive. It has a specific purpose. It's a purpose-driven spirituality. It's not spirituality for spirituality's sake. It's spirituality that is necessary in order to achieve the purpose that they are seeking. It's a communal spirituality, and I'll show you a little graphic of that in a sec. It's a spirituality that is not individual. It works with different groups. It's a spirituality that causes the CDO to go ahead. It's a spirituality that seeks to open things up. And it's a spirituality which one can even see as engaging all the elements of a triune God. Although the CDOs didn't talk in terms of Trinity, there were definitely, for me, elements of that. And two brief pictures there. The sense of communal spirituality, there's a sense of the thou, the God, the Trinitarian God, and the we, who is the CDO. But then there's also this, what I put as a lowercase thou, which is the community, the groups of people you're seeking to interact with and help, your so-called beneficiaries. And it's a spirituality that actually embraces all of these elements and brings them together. You know, the sort of concept of the African Ubuntu spirituality coming through. It's not an individual spirituality. And a little picture just to maybe sow some seeds about this Trinitarian spirituality. You would have seen we had that align, pursue, and act dynamic coming through strongly in the data. And it's really a sense of aligning with the Father and pursuing Jesus Christ and acting in the presence of the Holy Spirit, not in a never-ending, fateful cycle, but in something that is moving towards, you know, the eschaton, the consummation, when Jesus will return. You know, it's moving through time to make sense of the kingdom in history, in now. And so that's also that element. The element of helping holistically as a missional encounter. We find that the CDOs take their context very seriously. That's such an important element within mission. You know, we take what is the eternal word of God and we look at it in our context, and we start with our context, and we mount serious responses to a context. And of course, there was a lot to be said about the Cape Town context, which I can't cover now. The other element is that these missional encounters are intentional. You seek them out, you plan them, you find resources for them, you evaluate them. You know, they're intentional. They're not just chance encounters. Your missional encounters as CDOs are generative. They create change beyond themselves in their work. It's like you plant a seed. That's this thing of seeing others becoming way makers. You do something, but then it continues a life of its own. It's generative. A lot of kingdom principles coming through there. And this final one, which I called gestated, is that your missional encounters require this sort of womb-like space, this enabling help, this environment in which these encounters can take place. And then the final fourth element, yeah, I haven't got time to go into this, but just to say that what came through is that within the Cape Town context, we have this situation of continuous traumatic stress. And I drew strongly on the work of Lane Benjamin here. She's known to some of us. She's also a collaborator in the development sector, and a psychologist. And I drew on her understanding of the people of Cape Town so often living in states of continuous traumatic stress, and that these encounters of the CDOs are about encountering people living in this continuous trauma with compassion, and bringing with that the understanding of their understanding of a loving God, and fulfilling the role of being a compassionate witness that enables people to begin moving through and beyond the trauma. And finally, this concept of missional communities as sustaining organizations. Just want to get my papers here. The first part of it was looking at the CDO and saying the characteristics found in the CDO are that they are communities of belonging and participation. They are faith-based communities. They are purpose-driven communities. They're structured communities, and they're communities of reflection and learning. You know, that's what comes through from the data. The other element I didn't study the congregation, so therefore I'm not putting forward any characteristics of the congregation as a missional community. That's for someone else to do. But what I did look at and this speaks to your question again, Caroline, is the relationship between these different missional communities of congregation and CDO. So what we see in the data is that missional communities exist that are of different types. A congregation and a CDO are different, but I put to you, they can both be called missional communities. Missional communities are connected to one another. We see that in extending the church, extending the congregation, sorry, that there is connection, there's strong connections, there's a, you know, they're almost like siblings in a way, siblings where there's a little bit of, you know, discontent sometimes, but very connected. And then the other element is that these communities, these missional communities of congregation and CDO, they're flowing into one another. They, you know, use the word interpenetrating. They exist within each other. They flow into each other. And we need to recognize this and be able to enhance it as best we can. As I was trying to then make sense of these four elements and bringing them together, what is the relationship between them? In the missiological literature, there's quite a lot that talks about these two places in which the church exists in mission. And I'll just give you one illustrative quote from the South African missiologist David Bosch that talks to this point, as puts the church as an ellipse with two foci. So in and around the first, it acknowledges and enjoys the source of its life. This is where worship and prayer are emphasized. From and through the second focus, the church engages and challenges the world. Neither focus should ever be at the expense of the other. Rather, they stand in each other's service. Then Bosch quotes from another source where he says, the church is always and at the same time called out of the world and sent into the world. The church gathers to praise God, to enjoy fellowship, to receive spiritual sustenance, and disperses to serve God wherever its members are. It is called to hold in redemptive tension this dual orientation. So there's just a little graphic I put to sort of illustrate that. And as I was thinking about this over the number of years, the sort of picture that emerged to me was more this figure of 8, this infinity sign, it's called a lemniscate, strange word, but that this was more the dynamic that was happening when I looked at the data that was coming from the CDO. And overlaying those 5 areas of the theory of waymaking, we see on the one side, that sort of the inward side, you have both the congregation and the CDO as organizations. And on the other side, you have your encounters helping holistically. And what happens is that being faithful to their calling is what provides an impetus. It provides the initial and the ongoing impetus to the calling. And you kind of end up, if you go up a level and you lose the detail perhaps of the CDO and you start thinking more of the church generally in an ecclesial pattern, you end up with the sense of the church or the ecclesiology, the people of God, needing to exist and being called to exist in these two ways, the one as communities and the other as encounters. And the minute you have one and not the other, it's not really the fullness of the church. So an ecclesial pattern, as emerging from the theory of waymaking, this was my final conclusion, points to a missional church that receives her initial and ongoing impetus from her calling. It's animated by her spirituality, is visible to the world in her encounters, and is sustained by a particular community that exists within a community of communities. And then my final word was, certainly the CDO is a most worthy and necessary participant in God's mission and a missing dialogue partner in the missional conversation. So I apologize if I went rather fast there, but it's this view from the data of the CDO and putting it into a picture of church and how is church perceived as participating in God's mission, and seeing this flow that the calling draws you out of the congregation, it draws you out of your CDO and into the world where you have your missional encounters, in your case, the helping holistically. But then in order to sustain those encounters, you're always needing to be drawn back into your sustaining organization and into the congregation. And there's that ongoing in and out flow that is how we see a dynamic of church, or how I would see it emerging from this study. Right, Nadine, I'm going to stop there because it's 11 o'clock and we want people to be able to go into groups for at least 20 minutes and discuss. Can I hand back to you to give some instructions? We do have a question that we wanted to pose.
Yes, so yes, thank you, Deborah. I think just to say the feedback here is, you know, that to hear this language, which everyone is saying is so accessible and helpful. It's a very helpful concept for the kinds of work we do. People are excited about it. So that's fantastic. Also from my perspective to hear that. There was one question here. In your findings, how has the local church responded to CDOs doing activities, duties they see as belonging to the church? Seeing that the tension has always existed between the so-called parachurch, local church, don't they see CDOs as competition, especially that most of the manpower, I would say person power in the CDOs, comes from these local churches? That's a question from Nkosinati.
Nadine, I almost want to pass that question back to you, not because I can't have a theory about it, but because you have a good paper about this, which I don't think we haven't put it in the link yet, but you and I've forgotten his name, who was working at the warehouse. Not Papile, that other research you did, the elephant in the room.
Oh, with Mawetu.
With Mawetu.
Mawetu Ngaka, yeah.
That spoke to this point, didn't it? The relationship.
It spoke a little bit to it, that's right. So, I mean, I think that local churches said two things. The one was that local church leaders that we interviewed at that time, on the one hand, they saw parachurches. I don't like the term parachurch, so I do like the CDO term, but yes, traditionally, that's how we've talked about them. And I think Deborah's research challenges even this notion of parachurch. But what they said was at that time was that churches, local parachurches or CDOs as we know them, are both a help and a hindrance to church mobilization. On the one hand, they needed the expertise, they needed the input, they needed the support of CDOs in order to, because local congregations, congregation leaders sometimes don't have the capacity, skills, and time to do this kind of work further than relief action, which is not wrong, but you know, they couldn't move beyond relief. But on the other hand, sometimes they felt like the work disconnected them from part of what was also the local church's mission. And so I think the argument that Mawetu and I were making was very much in terms of what we found was saying we need to strengthen these partnerships. And I know that that's part of both Deborah and my passion, and we kind of hope that in this feedback there would be lots of congregation leaders. So maybe this is hinting at a follow-up conversation. Yeah. But let's see. Okay, well, Deborah, let's...
Sorry, just to add briefly there, I think, you know, my study was probably, we could say, an appreciative inquiry of the CDO. And one thing that we do need to be aware of, and I say we because I consider myself part of the CDO world, is that we don't just use the congregation for our delivery purposes. Sometimes have a very kind of low ecclesiology. We don't fully see, I don't know, we don't stand on holy ground enough when we start talking church. We just see it as a means, as an asset base and a way to achieve our non-profit or CDO goals and callings. And at the same time, I've also seen churches. I remember one time being involved in baptizing some beneficiaries of an organization. And we went as a CDO down to Fisher Beach, and we were at the catwalk, and we got into the water. I actually was also involved in baptizing one person, and there was a lot of kickback from a particular church that felt that we didn't have any authority to be baptizing people. You know, I've seen similar things happen when CDOs have communions, and it depends on whether you're sort of more formal church or more evangelical and free. But there is definitely that sense of this is our turf, and both sides sort of guard their turf and want to engage on their own level. And we need to start being able to find each other a bit more.
Thanks, Deborah, because we're part of the body of Christ. So I think part of what Deborah's research does is, even for me, like start to challenge like our very narrow understandings of what church is. And I think that some of the CDOs started to even say, well, what we're doing is church. It's maybe not traditionally understood in the form of the local church, but we're being church where we are. So yeah, these are all conversations maybe we should be picking up. Matt, I'm going to ask you now to put us into our groups. Before that, Deborah, just go through the questions that you have for the breakout groups.
I didn't prepare a question slide. I sent it through just on the WhatsApp. I'm not sure if Matt has had it. Matt says, I will post this question on the main screen just before the breakout. Oh, Matt, you are a star. Matt LeBlanc is residing in the Philippines, and he's my new favorite person. Thank you, Matt.
Your favorite person. No, we're kidding. There we go. There it is. A good grounded theory. So Deborah was based on a grounded theory. It's immediate, enduring, and it's a conceptual grab. It's like basically trying to grab all the data that's been explained and say, well, here's kind of a theory that we could use for praxis, right? So that was this waymaking, this theory of waymaking. So the question I want to ask you is, what grabbed you about this theory of waymaking, and what will make it useful for you? Is it useful? How is it useful? Or you could also just discuss generally in your group. But yeah, we'd like you to reflect on this question, and then any other comments you have to each other. Matt will now allocate you into your various groups like we had at the very beginning when we introduced each other. But maybe we can just start with some of the questions that we have. So welcome back, everybody. Those that are back and those that are coming back. What we want to do now is just have a general Q&A. And we know that one of the groups has already given feedback and said, oh, the second part was so rushed. We wanted to hear more. So I'm going to allow Deborah to respond to that one. And then also, just before we went to break, there were a lot of comments around the relationship between CDOs and congregations and that sort of tension. You know, people talking about fights arising when money that the congregation felt should go to the congregation went to a CDO. Also, somebody asked, Karen asked about, Deborah, is there a section in your research where you articulate this relationship and this tension between CDO and the congregation? And also, we have much to learn in terms of this kind of dynamic was also mentioned. So it seems that people appear to be interested in more of this kind of conversation. And I think Deborah and myself are really open to this. And like I said, it's one of our passions. So we'll do a poll as well, just to check how people feel about it. But for now, let's just see if there are any, if there's any feedback, if anybody wants to share feedback from the session or wants to ask a question, please do so in the chat. But Deborah, if you want to give any sort of more input on the whole, you know, the question about your research and what was the relationship that you discovered between the congregation and the CDO? What did you learn about that relationship?
Yeah. There is a lot more in the 300 pages that I've got here. I think it's a sense that first takeout is that there is a relationship, and quite a strong relationship, but that people aren't focusing on that relationship and reflecting on it. And I think that's the space that I would love to see us move in. And I don't often put out calls to say, get in touch with me if you want to talk about this, because everyone's busy. But this is something which, as Nadine said, we're both passionate about. And I think it's time to bring this relationship, which does exist, into the light and into an open dialogue space, and to be meeting and conversing and discerning together where the Lord would have us go as missional communities together. And obviously there are other forms of missional communities as well. Some businesses are missional communities, colleges and so forth. But we're talking particularly about the CDO and the congregation. So I would welcome us to create that space where we explicitly seek out this the relationship and seek to strengthen it and seek to collaborate with each other for God's mission and for this beautiful country of ours, you know, and the transformation that we can bring about, and for the city of ours, Cape Town. There's so much potential we have for change if we can just come together. Right.
Thanks, Deborah. I was busy typing there in the chat.
Sorry, I was just giving a little bit of a soapbox pitch, but it is something which, you know, if I spend the rest of my life on this, I will die happy because I so believe in the potential of the church and all of us playing our role in God's mission to actually impact the life of that person who is having a very difficult and unjust existence and addressing those systemic issues. So, yeah.
Thanks. I want to go to our poll. You guys have been participating in the poll, and the first question was, would you be interested in engaging further together with other CDOs and congregations on the topics addressed in the webinar? 100% said yes. The second question was, which topics are of interest to you? And it seems like the most popular at 85% is this thing of CDO congregational relationships. This is such an important conversation. 85%, 50% were interested in missional encounters, understood as compassion encountering trauma. And 45% on the CDO understood as a missional community. Maybe if Deborah had to unpack that a little bit more. And then firstly, the faith identity and spirituality of the CDO, 29%. I think there we've done quite a lot of work. Most of your FPO leaders, you're aware of what that means to you, and there's lots of research already out on that. So that makes total sense, but it seems like CDO and congregational relationships are really where it's at. And so we've got a lot of messages on the chat, also privately saying we'd really like to engage with this further. So it looks like people are interested in a follow-up. Deborah and I have chatted a little bit about this already, and actually this we've kind of said, oh, we hope that and participants say they're interested in a follow-up on congregations and CDOs. So, but we said we weren't going to preempt it too much, you know, let the spirit move. So it seems that the spirit has moved. So I think we'll definitely keep you updated on that. Deborah, any comments there? Oh, here's a question. So from Elaine and Nicole, question, could you please unpack a little bit more the so what question? Deborah, so that's for you.
Yes. Look, the so what question for me is that I spent a lot of time saying, what is actually going on in the CDO? How can we increase the limited knowledge of the practices and the, you know, the theological activity of these organizations? Once we've understood that, that in itself is, I feel, an important piece, because the CDOs are often not well understood. But the so what piece is really around saying, how do we move from a place where the CDO is considered as parachurch to the place where we have these missional communities? And the so what is that the CDO is one of multiple missional communities, and that speaks directly into how we see the church as it participates in mission. I rushed through that section. You know, it represents several chapters in my dissertation. Those of you that want to explore that further or have links to more of the literature or the characteristics that emerged, I'd be very happy to meet with a smaller group of you, either by webinar or, as COVID passes, Lord willing, to have a face-to-face meeting or even a conversation with just one or two of you, because it was a bit rushed. Nadine, you're on mute.
Thanks, Deborah. So Caroline, as you can see in the feed, says yes to the CDO as missional community and as expression of church.
Thank you, Caroline. You summed that up well.
Yeah,
I look forward to our future conversations.
There we go. I think there's lots of future conversations that could be taking place here. One of the questions that Deborah and I, and of course says, thank you, Doctor. There we go, Deborah. You must claim that title now.
I still need to be hit on the head, I think, don't I?
No, I say it's done. Deborah passed. By the way, Deborah passed extremely well. She got high praise from examiners and colleagues. So yeah, very proud of her. So let's just look at one last thing maybe before we go, if there are no further questions, and we'll keep our eye out for questions on the chat. Just in terms of, way forward. So I think one of the ways forward is definitely having a further conversation around the relationship between CDO and congregations. Deborah's also invited, other conversations with donors. If you want to skip, you can set that up. I think one of the questions we had, Deborah is the director now of Micah Global, and one of the questions we had was, would you like to have other FBO sort of gatherings like this one, or FBO network discussions? In 2015, Deborah, myself, colleagues like Renee and Caroline, and some of the others who are on this call, we were part of a discussion of FBOs looking at whether we wanted to actually form some kind of loose network. So not as tight as the Connect network, more a network of sharing and affiliation. But Deborah, perhaps you could just say a little bit more about that.
Yes, by all means. We had this conversation in 2015 at the warehouse under the title of an integral mission conversation. So integral mission just being mission understood as holistic, both word and deed. We had this conversation to say, did we as South African predominantly Christian development organizations want to network and interact more intentionally around topics that are important to us? And there are some of you on this call and others who are not on this call who are members of Micah Global. And I would be very happy to see us as South Africans, either as members of Micah Global, the network, or as those people who just want to come in and be part of the conversation, to meet under that sort of name of Micah Global in South Africa, to have this conversation that specifically looks at CDO and congregational relationships, because I believe it's an offering that we can make not only within Cape Town and within South Africa, but it's an offering that we can make to the world if this is something that we believe we have some findings on and some way in which we want to develop. So what I'm going to do is I've just putting in the chat there, if you want to engage further, you can email me. I'll keep track of the names and contact you in due course. I always say from the middle of the middle of November to the middle of January, don't try and start anything new, because even with COVID, I think people want to sort of start shutting down. But, obviously Nadine and I can talk, and we can start looking towards the new year time, maybe sometime around February, late January, to come together with some sort of a set of steps that we might follow to have these conversations around CDO and congregational relationships. You can also, you're welcome to do a little sales spiel. You're welcome to join Micah Global, any of you, because it's not only open to CDOs, it's open to any group, and it includes congregations that are involved in relief, development, care, and advocacy work. And it has quite a strong focus of organizations in the majority world. So even today, we have some people from the Philippines joining us. It's a wonderful network to connect with people around the world on topics that are of interest to your particular CDO. So do go and look at micaglobal.org and see if it's something that you think it would be good for you to be part of. But yeah, personally, even over and above my work role, I'm committed to this conversation, and I'm very excited to have Nadine on this conversation too, because I must just say, I did write it down somewhere that you were the most wonderful supervisor. And yeah, no, I would have, I would have walked the world flat to find someone who had that sense of both the congregation and the CDO. So it was a tremendous privilege to study under you and at the University of Stellenbosch. I just wanted to put that out there. And also, I wanted to thank those organizations. I can't name you because of ethics, but this is your data. I was just the facilitator and the curator of it, and I hope I curated it well for you. But I'm endlessly grateful to you for sharing so openly.
Yes, thank you, Deborah. You nearly made me cry there. Like to cry in public.
You nearly made me cry a few times, Nadine.
I don't know if that was in a good or a bad way. Everybody, friends, I think we're drawing this to a close, and I just want to echo Deborah's gratefulness for the participation of all of you today, but also for those that participated in the broader study and in Deborah's PhD study. We really want this kind of research to be in service of society. So we don't just do research because it's a fun thing to do or because we're interested in it. We really want to engage and interact with you and see how we can broaden the conversation, how we can advocate even for perspectives sometimes that are not mainstreamed within the church and within theological studies. So each one of you are heroes actually to us. I know to me, I can say personally, I know to Deborah, and we're so appreciative of the significant kingdom work you are doing, because this is God's mission that you're participating in. So there I get emotional. So thank you everybody for this wonderful conversation. Thank you very much to Matt LeBlanc all the way in the Philippines, assisting us here on the technical side. Deborah is actually a tech whiz as well, but to have Matt, who knows so much about Zoom and is so also committed to this integral mission conversation, part of the team, we are so appreciative. We see there, please include the Philippines in prayer. As we talk now, many communities are submerged in a flood. Evacuation centers crowded in the midst of the pandemic. Colin is saying we're always praying for you, Emil. So please keep the Philippines in your prayers. Perhaps we can close with a prayer for the Philippines. We're part of a bigger network here, and I think a bigger group of people worldwide, Christians, committed to God's mission. So thank you, everyone. Let's close in a word of prayer quickly. Let's just pray together. Lord, we thank you for this time that we could spend as your people, listening to what you are doing and the way that you are moving in this world, and the way that all of us are participants in what you are doing in your world. All of this we want to offer for the glory of your kingdom, Lord, and for your name, and for your name's sake alone. Lord, we think of those in the Philippines right now, our friends, our fellow Christians, those who don't know you, and we ask, Lord, your mercy and grace would be their portion at this time, Lord, that you would protect them and even deliver. So we thank you, Lord Jesus, that we can join together in this way, even virtually. And I pray your blessing and your peace on each and every participant as we go now to our various work that's lying before us during this day. In the name of Jesus, amen.
And if I can just say one closing word, I'd just like to thank Lynette Lambrecht, who did all the administration.
Yes, sorry, Lynette.
With you. And to the warehouse that created for us a transitioning space, and for me, a transitioning space out of academia and back into practitioner land. So thank you to the warehouse. We appreciate and love you.
We do. Thank you, Warehouse, for hosting us. We wish we could have been in the building, although they're not in that building anymore. But we thank God for your work and your witness. They're also Micah Global member, by the way, so you can ask them about the benefits. There's Caroline waving if you want to know more. But thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful day. It was great to be with all of you. Hope to see you in person
everyone.
soon.
Bye.